Snow blanketed the small, quiet town of Clover Hill, Vermont, on that Christmas Eve. The gentle glow of Christmas lights reflected off the frost-covered windows, and the air carried the faint scent of pine and cinnamon. The streets bustled with last-minute shoppers and families hurrying home to celebrate. But at the edge of town, in a dilapidated old house that leaned slightly to the left, there was no laughter, no lights, and no sign of festivity. Inside lived Walter Haynes, a man once full of life, now a shadow of himself. Walter was 78 years old, and for the first time in his life, he was completely alone. Just 6 months earlier, he had been surrounded by the family he loved dearly, his daughter Clara, her husband, and his 2 lively grandchildren who used to fill the house with noise and laughter. Walter had always been the cornerstone of his family, a retired carpenter who loved to whittle tiny wooden animals for the kids. But after Clara's family decided to relocate to California for her husband's job, Walter had insisted they go without him. "Don't worry about me," he had said with a reassuring smile. "I've got my routine, and I'll visit you soon." But that visit never happened. Clara called less frequently as her life got busier, and though she promised to return for Christmas, those promises were always followed by maybe next year. The last phone call had been particularly hard. "Dad, we're so sorry," she had said, her voice filled with guilt. "But flights are just so expensive and we've got so much going on." Walter had assured her it was fine, but after hanging up, the silence in his house had felt deafening. He didn't blame Clara. Life was busy and he understood that, but it didn't make the loneliness any easier. The house, which once smelled of baked cookies and wood shavings from Walter's small workshop, now reeked of stale air and unwashed dishes. Walter, who had always been meticulous, had let things slide. The mail piled up, his workshop gathered dust, and meals were often just a can of soup heated on the stove. But the worst part of it all wasn't the mess or the cold, it was the memories. Everywhere Walter looked, he saw ghosts of his past. The stockings that once hung by the fireplace, now packed away in a forgotten box, and the family photographs that still sat on the mantel, staring back at him with hollow smiles. Christmas Eve was just another day for Walter. He didn't bother turning on the lights. What was the point? He sat in his worn-out armchair, staring blankly out the window as snow continued to fall, his breath misting the glass. Outside, children dragged sleds behind them, and couples held hands as they walked beneath the glow of twinkling lights. Walter felt like a stranger in his own world, as though life had gone on without him. He had thought about calling Clara but decided against it. She had her family, her life. He didn't want to be a burden. As the hours crept by, Walter's eyelids grew heavy. He pulled a thin blanket over himself and leaned back in his chair, hoping sleep would come quickly. But just as he was about to drift off, a faint sound broke through the silence. It was soft at first, almost imperceptible, but it grew louder. A persistent scratching at the door, followed by a faint, pitiful meow. Walter opened his eyes, startled. "What on earth?" he muttered, hauling himself up with some effort. His joints ached and his knees protested with every step as he shuffled toward the door. When he opened it, a gust of icy wind rushed in, but Walter barely noticed. Sitting on the porch, shivering against the cold, was a small cat. Its fur was gray and white, matted and dusted with snow. Its green eyes, wide and pleading, locked onto Walter's as it let out another soft meow. For a moment, Walter just stared. He hadn't seen another living soul in days, and the sight of this tiny creature, so vulnerable and alone, tugged at something deep inside him. "Where did you come from?" Walter asked, his voice raspy from disuse. The cat tilted its head as though considering the question before letting out another meow. Walter hesitated. He wasn't much of a cat person, and besides, he barely had enough food for himself. But as he looked at the little creature, trembling and fragile, he felt a pang of guilt. "Oh, all right," he muttered, stepping aside. "Come on in." The cat hesitated for a moment before darting inside, its small paws leaving wet prints on the worn wooden floor. Walter closed the door quickly to keep the cold out, then turned to look at his unexpected guest. The cat was already exploring, sniffing at the furniture and batting at a stray piece of thread on the carpet. Walter couldn't help but smile faintly. "You've got some nerve, inviting yourself in like this," he said. The cat ignored him, hopping onto the armchair as though it owned the place. Walter shuffled to the kitchen and rummaged through his cabinets. He found a can of tuna that had been sitting there for months and opened it, placing the contents on a plate. "Here you go," he said, setting it on the floor. The cat leapt down immediately, devouring the food with gusto. As Walter watched, he felt an unfamiliar warmth spread through his chest. It wasn't much, but for the first time in a long time, he didn't feel completely alone. The hours passed, and as the snowstorm outside grew fiercer, the little cat curled up on Walter's lap, purring softly. Walter stroked its fur absent-mindedly, his fingers tracing the patterns of gray and white. "Guess we're both strays, huh?" he murmured. The cat blinked up at him as if it understood, then closed its eyes, content. Walter felt a lump form in his throat. He hadn't realized how much he missed this companionship, even if it came in the form of a scrappy little cat. As the clock struck midnight and Christmas Day officially began, Walter found himself whispering, "Merry Christmas, little one." The cat responded with a soft purr, and for the first time in months, Walter felt something he thought he'd lost forever: hope. The morning light crept through the frosted windows, casting a soft glow over the cluttered living room. Walter woke up to the gentle vibration of purring against his chest. For a moment, he forgot about the loneliness, the emptiness of the house. Instead, he opened his eyes to find the little gray and white cat curled up on his chest, staring at him with its emerald green eyes. "So you're still here," he mumbled, his voice gruff from sleep. It had been years since Walter had woken up to anything other than silence. He gently lifted the cat and set it on the floor before stretching out his stiff joints. "All right, let's see what we can do for breakfast," he said, shuffling to the kitchen. The cupboards were almost bare, but he managed to find some oatmeal for himself and another can of tuna for the cat. "You're lucky I had that," he muttered as he placed the plate down. The cat ignored him, happily devouring the meal. Walter didn't realize it yet, but something in him had shifted. He found himself tidying up the kitchen for the first time in months, sweeping the floor, and even washing the pile of dishes in the sink. He spoke to the cat as he worked, sharing little tidbits about his life. "I was a carpenter, you know. Built most of the furniture in this house," he said, glancing at the chair the cat had claimed as its throne. "My daughter, Clara, used to sit there with her kids. They'd read Christmas stories." His voice trailed off, and for a moment, the ache of solitude crept back in. The cat, as if sensing his sadness, jumped onto the counter and nudged his hand with its head. Walter smiled faintly. "You're a good listener, aren't you?" he said, scratching behind its ears. As the days passed, the cat became a constant companion. Walter named it Mittens after noticing the white fur on its paws, which reminded him of little gloves. Mittens followed him everywhere, from the kitchen to the dusty workshop in the garage. Walter even found himself picking up his old tools again, repairing the broken leg of a chair and sanding down the edges of a forgotten birdhouse he had once built for his granddaughter. But despite the warmth Mittens brought into Walter's life, the reality of his situation loomed large. His savings were running out, and the house was falling apart. The roof leaked when it snowed. The heating barely worked, and he hadn't been able to pay the electric bill in weeks. On a particularly cold night, the power finally went out. Walter sat in the dark, wrapped in a blanket, with Mittens curled up on his lap. "Well, buddy," he said softly, "looks like we're in a bit of trouble." The next morning, Walter decided he had to do something. He bundled up in his old coat and scarf, stuffed a few wooden carvings into a bag, and trudged into town. It had been years since he'd sold any of his work, but he hoped the holiday season would inspire some generosity. The streets were bustling with people finishing their Christmas shopping, and Walter felt out of place among the cheerful crowds. He set up a small table outside the general store and carefully arranged his carvings, small animals, ornaments, and even a tiny nativity scene. Hours passed, but no one stopped. People walked by, their arms full of bags, too busy to notice the elderly man and his little wooden creations. Walter's fingers grew numb from the cold, and despair began to creep in. Mittens, who had followed him into town, sat faithfully by his feet, her green eyes scanning the crowd as if searching for someone who might help. Just as Walter was about to pack up and go home, a young boy tugged at his mother's sleeve and pointed to the table. "Mom, look," the boy exclaimed. It's a kitty, just like ours. He bent down to pet Mittens, who purred and rubbed against his hand. The boy's mother smiled and picked up one of Walter's carvings, a small, intricately detailed cat. "This is beautiful," she said. "Did you make this?" Walter nodded, his voice shaky. "Yes, ma'am, all by hand." She bought the carving and another ornament, handing Walter a crisp $20 bill. "Merry Christmas," she said warmly. Walter managed a small smile, his heart lifting slightly. Word began to spread. People stopped to admire Walter's work, and one by one, the carvings disappeared from the table. By the end of the day, Walter had earned enough to buy groceries and even pay a portion of his overdue bills. He treated himself to a hot cup of coffee at the diner, with Mittens perched on the seat beside him, much to the amusement of the other patrons. But the relief was short-lived. That evening, as Walter walked back home with Mittens trotting beside him, he slipped on an icy patch of sidewalk. He fell hard, his body twisting awkwardly as pain shot through his leg. Mittens yowled and circled him frantically as he tried to get up. But the pain was too intense. Walter realized with dread that he might have broken something. The street was empty, and his house was still several blocks away. "Help," Walter called out weakly, but his voice was swallowed by the howling wind. Mittens, however, didn't hesitate. She darted down the street, her small body disappearing into the night. Walter watched her go, his heart sinking. He thought she was abandoning him, leaving him there to fend for himself. Minutes felt like hours as Walter lay on the cold ground, shivering and in pain. Just as he was beginning to lose hope, he heard a voice. "Sir, are you okay?" A young man in a puffer jacket was hurrying toward him, with Mittens trotting at his heels. "She came running up to me, meowing like crazy," the man said as he knelt beside Walter. "It's like she knew you needed help." With the man's assistance, Walter was able to get to his feet and lean on him for support. They made their way back to Walter's house, where the young man helped him inside and insisted he call a doctor. Walter looked down at Mittens, who had already curled up on the armchair as if nothing extraordinary had happened. "You little rascal," he said, his voice choked with emotion. "You saved me." That night, as Walter sat in his chair with his leg wrapped in a makeshift splint, he looked at Mittens and felt something he hadn't felt in a long time: gratitude. This tiny creature, who had wandered into his life on the loneliest night of the year, had not only given him companionship, but had also gone out of her way to protect him. The days following Walter's fall were among the hardest of his life. His leg, bruised and swollen, made even the simplest tasks nearly impossible. Every step was a painful reminder of how vulnerable he had become. The young man who had helped him home, Eric, had offered to take him to a doctor, but Walter had refused. "I'll be fine," he insisted, though he knew it wasn't true. He didn't want to burden anyone else with his problems. Eric, however, refused to disappear completely. He showed up every couple of days with groceries or a warm meal from the diner, always staying just long enough to check in on Walter before heading back to his own busy life. It was a kindness Walter hadn't expected, and it warmed him more than he cared to admit. But still, he kept his walls up. "Thank you," he'd say gruffly, before retreating into his solitude. Mittens, of course, stayed by his side. The little cat seemed to sense his pain, curling up next to his injured leg, as if to lend him strength. Walter often found himself talking to her, telling her things he hadn't told another soul. "I was a proud man once, you know," he said one evening as she lay sprawled across his lap. "Built houses with my bare hands, took care of my family. Now look at me, can't even walk to the kitchen without feeling like I'm going to collapse." Mittens looked up at him, her green eyes calm and unwavering, and let out a soft purr. It wasn't much, but it was enough to make Walter feel less alone. The turning point came on a cold January morning, a few weeks after his fall. Walter was sitting in his armchair, staring out the window at the snow-covered yard, when he heard the sound of shoveling. Frowning, he struggled to his feet and hobbled to the door. Peering outside, he saw Eric clearing his driveway with a snow shovel. Next to him was a little girl, no older than 8, bundled up in a bright pink coat. She was laughing as she tried to scoop up the snow with her tiny shovel, her blonde curls peeking out from beneath her hat. Walter opened the door a crack, the icy air biting at his face. "What are you doing out there?" he called, his voice sharper than he intended. Eric straightened up and wiped the sweat from his brow. "Morning, Mr. Haynes," he said cheerfully. "Just thought I'd clear your driveway for you. Figured it might make things easier." Walter was about to protest when the little girl ran up to him, holding something in her mittened hands. "Hi," she said brightly. "I'm Sophie. Look what I found." She opened her hands to reveal a small wooden bird, its wings delicately carved and painted a soft blue. Walter recognized it immediately. It was one of his carvings, lost in the snow during his trek to town weeks earlier. His heart ached as he realized how far it had traveled from his table. "That's yours, isn't it?" Eric asked, walking up beside her. Sophie saw it sticking out of a snowbank. "Pretty incredible work." Walter took the bird from Sophie's hands, his fingers trembling slightly. "I made this years ago," he said quietly. "Didn't think I'd ever see it again." "You're really talented," Eric said. "I've been meaning to ask, why don't you sell more of these? I'm sure plenty of people would love to buy them." Walter shook his head. "I don't have the energy for it anymore," he muttered. "And besides, who's gonna care about an old man's carvings?" "I care," Sophie said, her voice earnest. "It's really pretty." Something about the way she said it, so simple, so sincere, struck a chord in Walter. He looked down at the bird in his hand, then at Mittens, who was perched on the windowsill, watching the scene unfold. The cat's green eyes seemed to hold a quiet encouragement, as if urging him to take a chance. That night, Walter sat in his workshop for the first time in years. The air was cold, and his legs still throbbed, but his hands felt steady as they picked up his tools. Mittens watched from her spot on the workbench as Walter carefully sanded a piece of wood, shaping it into the beginnings of a new carving. It was slow work. His fingers weren't as nimble as they used to be. But for the first time in a long time, he felt a sense of purpose. Over the next few weeks, Walter threw himself into his work. Each morning, he hobbled to his workshop with Mittens by his side, and each evening he emerged with a new creation. Birds, deer, Christmas ornaments, and, of course, tiny cats with white mittens. Eric stopped by often to check on him, always bringing Sophie, who quickly became Walter's biggest fan. She would sit on a stool in the corner of the workshop, watching in awe as he worked. "You should sell these online," Eric suggested one day. "I can help you set up a shop. It's easy, and you'd be surprised how many people are looking for handmade stuff like this." Walter was hesitant at first. He didn't know the first thing about computers, let alone selling things online. But Eric was persistent, and with his help, Walter's carvings found their way onto a small website. At first, there were only a few orders, mostly from people in town who had heard about his work. But then, one of Sophie's teachers posted a picture of Walter's carvings on social media, and everything changed. Within days, the orders began pouring in. People from all over the country wanted Walter's creations, and Eric worked tirelessly to help him manage the influx. Walter couldn't believe it. For the first time in years, his work was being appreciated. And it wasn't just about the money. It was about the connection. Each carving he made felt like a bridge to a world he had thought he'd lost forever. And through it all, Mittens remained his steadfast companion. She would curl up on the workbench, her soft purring filling the room as Walter carved late into the night. It was as if she had always been meant to be there, guiding him toward this new chapter of his life. By the time spring began to thaw Clover Hill's icy streets, Walter Haynes was a changed man. The man who had once sat alone in his dimly lit house, drowning in silence and regret, now woke up each day with a sense of purpose. His mornings began early, with Mittens stretching lazily at his feet as sunlight poured through the once-forgotten windows of his living room. Walter's workshop had become a bustling center of activity, the smell of sawdust and varnish filling the air as he worked on new pieces to keep up with the steady stream of orders from his online store. Eric and Sophie visited often, their bond with Walter growing stronger with each passing day. Sophie had taken to calling him Grandpa Walt, a name that made Walter's heart swell with warmth every time he heard it. "You know, Grandpa Walt," she said one afternoon, sitting on her usual stool in the workshop, "I think Mittens is your lucky charm. She brought you back to life." Walter chuckled, pausing his work to scratch Mittens behind the ears. "I think you might be right, kiddo," he said softly. She showed up just when I needed her most. Eric was the one who finally convinced Walter to share more of his story. "People love what you make, Walt," he said one evening as they packed up finished carvings to ship out. "But I think they'd love to know the man behind it all. It'd make what you do even more special." With Eric's help, Walter wrote a short bio for his online shop, sharing a bit about his life as a carpenter, his love for crafting, and of course, the day Mittens appeared on his doorstep. The story struck a chord. Customers began leaving messages with their orders, thanking Walter for sharing his journey and telling him how much his work and his resilience had inspired them. One woman wrote, "Your story reminds me of my own grandfather, who also found joy in woodworking. Every time I see your carvings, I think of him." Another wrote, "I've been going through a hard time, but your story and your beautiful art give me hope." As the orders grew, so did the connections Walter made with people from all walks of life. He found himself responding to messages late into the night, sharing advice, encouragement, or just a kind word. For the first time in years, he felt like he mattered again, not just to the people in his town, but to strangers all over the country who saw his work and his story as a beacon of light. But while Walter's life was improving, it wasn't without challenges. His leg never fully healed from the fall, and the pain often flared up after long hours in the workshop. On days when the ache became too much to bear, he would sit by the window with Mittens on his lap, staring out at the garden that had once been Clara's pride and joy. The emptiness he felt for his daughter and grandchildren still lingered, a shadow that even Mittens couldn't completely chase away. One evening, as Walter was finishing a set of small bird carvings, his phone buzzed on the workbench. It was Clara. He hesitated before answering, unsure of what to say. "Hi, Dad." Her voice came through tentative and soft. How are you?" "I'm fine," Walter said gruffly, though his throat tightened with emotion. "How's California?" "Busy," Clara admitted. "But I've been meaning to call. I saw the article about you." Walter blinked. "Article?" "Yes," Clara continued. "Someone shared your shop and your story online, and it's gone viral. Dad, people are talking about you all over social media. I'm so proud of you." Her voice broke slightly, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. Finally, she said, "I'm sorry I haven't been there for you. I should have called more, should have visited." Walter swallowed hard, his eyes stinging. "It's all right, Clara. Life gets busy." "No," she said firmly. "It's not all right. I want to fix this. The kids miss you so much, and, well, we were thinking of coming out for Easter, if that's okay." Walter's heart felt like it might burst. You want to come home?" he asked, his voice trembling. "Of course," Clara said. "We all do." When Walter hung up, his hands shook as he placed the phone down. Mittens jumped onto the bench, nuzzling his arm as if to say, "See, I told you things would get better." Walter laughed through his tears, scooping the cat into his arms. "You're the best thing that's ever happened to me. You know that?" The weeks leading up to Easter were a whirlwind. Walter cleaned the house from top to bottom, with Eric and Sophie's help. He even managed to fix the leaky roof with some of the money he'd earned from his carvings. The garden, neglected for so long, was brought back to life, with fresh flowers blooming just in time for Clara's arrival. When Easter morning finally came, Walter stood on his front porch, leaning on his cane as a car pulled into the driveway. Clara stepped out first, her face a mixture of joy and guilt as she ran to hug her father. Behind her came the kids, who squealed with delight at the sight of their grandfather and the gray and white cat perched on his shoulder. "Grandpa!" they shouted, racing toward him. Walter crouched down as best he could, wrapping them in his arms as tears streamed down his face. For the first time in years, his house was filled with laughter and life again. Over the next few days, Walter showed Clara and the kids his workshop, teaching the grandchildren how to carve simple shapes out of wood. They marveled at his creations and listened intently as he told them about the day Mittens had appeared at his door. "She saved me," he said simply. "She reminded me that there's always something to hold on to, even when things seem hopeless." Clara wiped a tear from her eye. "Thank you for not giving up, Dad," she said. "I don't think I could have forgiven myself if you had." Walter smiled, looking down at Mittens, who was sprawled across his workbench, purring contentedly. "She didn't let me give up," he said. "She wouldn't let me." By the time Clara and the kids left, Walter's heart felt fuller than it had in years. They promised to visit again soon, and this time, Walter believed them. As he stood in the doorway, watching their car disappear down the road, Mittens rubbed against his leg, her green eyes shining up at him. "Well, Mittens," Walter said, bending down to scoop her up, "looks like we're not alone anymore." He carried her back into the house, the sunlight streaming through the windows, illuminating the tiny wooden animals scattered across the shelves. It wasn't just a house anymore. It was a home again. The soft hum of spring filled the air in Clover Hill. Birds chirped in the trees, flowers stretched toward the sun, and Walter Haynes sat on his porch with Mittens curled up beside him. The old house, once a place of sorrow and isolation, now felt alive again. The windows sparkled, the garden bloomed, and the faint smell of fresh sawdust drifted from the workshop in the garage. Inside, shelves lined the walls, filled with Walter's intricate carvings, each one a reminder of how far he had come. Walter looked down at Mittens, who was stretched lazily across his lap, one paw dangling over the side. "You know, little one," he murmured, "I never thought I'd feel like this again. Like I've got something to live for." Mittens let out a soft purr, her green eyes flickering open briefly before closing again, content. Word about Walter's story continued to spread. Orders still came in from all over the country, more than Walter could handle on his own. But he didn't mind. Eric and Sophie often helped him pack and ship them, turning what could have been a burden into a joyful collaboration. On weekends, Sophie sat beside him in the workshop, learning how to carve her own small figures. She proudly displayed her first creation, a clumsy but heartfelt wooden cat, on the mantel in Walter's living room. But the greatest joy of all was his renewed relationship with Clara and her family. True to her word, Clara brought the kids back often, filling the house with laughter and energy. Walter taught his grandchildren the same woodworking skills he had passed on to Clara when she was little. The sight of their small hands carefully sanding wood filled Walter with a deep, unshakable pride. One afternoon, Clara found Walter sitting on the porch with Mittens. She placed a hand on his shoulder and smiled. "I've missed this, Dad," she said. "I've missed you." Walter placed his hand over hers, his eyes misty. "I missed you too, sweetheart. But I think we've both learned something, haven't we? No matter how far apart we are, family always finds its way back." That evening, as Walter sat in his armchair with Mittens purring beside him, he thought back to that fateful Christmas Eve. The night the little gray and white cat had scratched at his door. She had been just as lost and lonely as he had, but together they had found their way. Mittens had given him more than companionship. She had given him hope, reminding him that even in the darkest times, there is light to be found. Walter closed his eyes, his hand resting gently on Mittens' fur. "Thank you," he whispered, "for everything." The world outside grew quiet as night fell, but inside the house, there was warmth, love, and the steady, reassuring sound of a cat's purr, a melody that spoke of second chances and the quiet magic of unexpected miracles. Sometimes the smallest gestures, a knock at the door, a paw on your lap, can change a life forever. Walter's story is a reminder that even in our darkest moments, there's always hope, and that love, in all its forms, has the power to heal us.